So with that brief introduction, I'll hand it over to Dr. Michael Finewood to present the breakfast webinar.
Okay, thanks Emily and Jen. And let me just share my screen here. And Emily, is everything looking okay? Cool. Okay, so yeah, let me just begin by saying thanks to Emily and Jen and the Watershed Alliance for inviting me to talk. Like a good academic, I love talking about my research, and this is a really cool collaborative project that I think has a lot of applicability that hopefully we can all learn from and build on. So the title of the talk today is Lessons from the Hudson River Watershed, the Importance of Capacity Building in Watershed Groups. And really what we're going to do today is talk about the needs assessment research that we did and the capacity building programs that really came out of that research that Emily mentioned just now and that we're working with Hudson River Watershed Groups. I always like to sort of start with the acknowledgments, just to let everybody know that while it's my name on the title of this slide, there's no way that a project like this could happen without all our partners and all the different people that work on it, all the different participants. So obviously we would need to acknowledge the Watershed Alliance and Emily and Jen and the great work that they're doing. I didn't put a bullet point here. I don't know why. I want to acknowledge all of our participants in the project who gave us their time and their knowledge and their expertise. PACE really supported this project in a lot of different ways, but in particular, I had a lot of students work with me over the years on different parts of this project, mainly Jane Toiber, Chloe Stalker, Bronwyn Stobert, a bunch of other students. So we did little bits and pieces here. But I'd be remiss if I didn't say that Chloe and Bronwyn are also on the job market right now. So if you happen to have one of them come across your desk, they're great students. And it is my dream to have our students, not just PACE students, but BARD students and other students, all across who are all getting training and who will eventually be working in the watershed world in our region one day. So keep an eye out for them. And finally, we need to talk about our funding and our collaborative partners, the Estuary Program, DEC, uh, funding from the State Environmental Protection Fund, as well as our ongoing work with NUI-PIC, right? And so a lot of this work couldn't happen without those partnerships as well. All right, so here's what we're going to do today. I'll begin by talking a little bit about the Watershed Alliance, me and PACE, and how kind of the different missions here sort of weave together to drive this project. I'm going to get into some concepts and definitions, and while it will be a little bit wonky, I think it's worthwhile because we are really speaking to a field and a group of people, so we want to have some shared ideas. And then I'll get into the project itself. I'll talk about how we developed it, a little bit about our methods and context, and then mainly talk about the outcomes, what we learned about capacity. And from that, we'll talk about some of the things that the Watershed Alliance has been doing to kind of meet those needs that we identified through the research, and that's in our capacity building programs. And in the last slide, I'll talk a little bit about next steps. So just some final thoughts and next steps. Over here to the right, this is the paper that we published from this research. So if you're interested in this, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to share a copy with you. And I'm pretty sure Jen's also going to share a link to the paper that we have on the website. So please go get it. And you can also find the needs assessment report on the website, as well as lots of other bits of information that I'll talk about here in a little bit. Okay, so I know you're familiar with the Watershed Alliance, but I really think it's worth revisiting the mission statement of the Watershed Alliance because, like I said, it was a pretty big driver for what we were doing in this project. So we view ourselves as an umbrella organization, and it's our job to really work with communities, to empower communities to both improve the communities themselves as well as protect their local water resources. And we see a key way of doing that by providing support for watershed groups, trying to find ways to facilitate or make them help them effectively meet their mission and goals. For me, just so you can get to know a little bit about me, I know I've met many people on this call, but it's probably worthwhile knowing a little bit about my background. I'm a human geographer and political ecologist. So what that really means is I think a lot about spatial organization, and as a political ecologist, I think a lot about the politics of environmental change and conditions. I'm a social scientist, which means that I use interviews, surveys, ethnographic approaches in my field work. I'm really getting out and I'm talking to people and using that information to sort of draw bigger conclusions. Um, a lot of the research I've been doing lately is on capacity and resilience. It's not the only work that I've done, but where my focus is has been the last few years. Although I've done quite a bit less research recently, and that's because I am also chair of the Department of Environmental Studies and Science at Pace University. So I'm pretty involved in sort of administrative work over there. I'm also on the board of the Watershed Alliance, and so in full disclosure, I have a lot of vested interest in what we're talking about today. I like to talk about my department because I think we're doing a lot of really cool stuff, and I want other people to work with us. I usually start off by talking about our department, by talking about our discipline. And so the field of environmental studies and science to me is interdisciplinary, multiple people with different backgrounds trying to solve problems. And the problem solving part of it is also very instrumental in our field, right? We're doing work that's not just science for science sake, which is fine, but we're really looking to solve some of these vexing, wicked problems that we're dealing with today, things like climate change. So as a department, we've really internalized those values and sort of thought about how we can engage with communities to do research that helps communities, that improves communities, that helps specifically to think about environmental conditions. And a lot of these sort of projects, the classes that we teach have these field-based experiences in them. So if you are in an institution that needs a partner or is looking for a partner, particularly if you're in our geographic footprint, please reach out. We want to work with you, and we've got a lot of really cool examples of things that we have done. Working with municipalities, for example, where we sort of provide something. If you saw the last breakfast series with Bard, or if you saw that on YouTube or you were there, that's a very similar model that we're trying to adopt. Okay, so let's get into some of the wonky stuff here. This is the like academic stuff that excites me. Um, I think we need to start by, when we're thinking about things like capacity, we're actually really talking about the concept of resilience. And so many of you have probably worked with this idea of resilience, and particularly as it may apply to your particular institution. Broadly speaking, when we define resilience, it's a system's ability to anticipate, withstand, and recover from the effects of some type of event, right? So you could think of like a storm or a hurricane or something like that, something very almost stochastic or dramatic, right? That really has an impact on a particular place. So the resilience is a measure of how quickly, right, that place, the political systems, the ecological systems, the social systems can bounce back to normal after that event, right? So we often think of resilience as sort of a function of a system, and it comes from ecology. And this is something that we see a lot, where we see a concept that comes from the ecological field, and we in the kind of resource management world adopt it and try to put it sort of in a social context as well. I think that's fine. It's sort of it's useful for us, but it's also worth really thinking about because obviously when we think about those systems separately, that's problematic, and as well as thinking about ecology versus social systems, you know, that those concepts don't always sort of move back and forth seamlessly. But for now, suffice it to say that when we think about resilience, we're thinking about the social, economic, ecological, political, right? Everything involved in what we would think of as constituting a system. Now, capacity, right, is a way of sort of thinking about that resilience, right? So when we think about a resilient system, a more resilient system has good or more capacity, right? So the capacity is what builds resilience. That capacity to effectively prepare for and respond to future crises. So we, in the paper, try to put a definition to this, and that's the second bullet point that you're seeing here. Specifically, as we think about watershed groups, right? So watershed groups with capacity or good capacity, right, have established learning and organizational processes that allow for robust responses to and anticipation of future change, right? So an ability to sort of sustain or maintain over a period of time and through different types of events. So these groups that we're talking about also are, we spent some time thinking about the definitions of this, and you know, maybe not perfect, but I think pretty effective. So watershed groups are community-based coalitions working to improve communities and protect local water bodies through a watershed framework. Now, as I give you that definition, you're probably thinking of all the different groups that you've worked with, and you know that there's a lot of diversity amongst these groups, like within and amongst these groups. They have different ways of being structured. They have different missions. Sometimes they're singular, sometimes they're sort of big picture. They sort of wax and wane as groups. And so the diversity of the groups within this concept is important to recognize, right? So if you're thinking of this definition and it feels imperfect, yeah, it probably is a little bit. What's more important to think about watershed group is that they fill gaps in watershed governance. And what I mean by that is watershed groups can often do things that other institutions can't, right? They can be advocates. They can be singularly focused on an issue. They can pivot often very quickly. They can rally people within the community. So if you think of like municipalities and the limitations they have, or the private sector and the limitations they have, oftentimes watershed groups can fill those gaps in watershed governance. So they play a really important role. And what do we mean by a watershed framework? Well, that's thinking of governance of our resources, of our communities through this watershed, through a kind of watershed boundary, right? So we think of a watershed as a system, that sort of interconnectivity. And while oftentimes as we sort of think of a watershed and its governance, we have to go beyond those borders, it's really sort of thinking about how we sort of interact within a watershed. And as we know, right, watersheds can be sort of politically fractured, they can be socially fractured, right? And that makes watershed governance a challenge. And again, this is where we see watershed groups playing a really important role, right? They can sort of help bring those different constituencies together. I'm going to make a brief aside to say that if you are a nerd like me and you're really into thinking about these concepts, Kate Meyer-Dirks, myself, and Christiana Bennett published a paper defining watersheds. I think this was last year, which very much connects to the research we're doing here. So go grab that if you're interested. You could reach out to me or Kate or anybody to get a copy of that. Okay, back to what we're talking about here. So, capacity itself within water groups is like I described, right? It's this ability for that organization to prepare for and respond to change, right? Or the things that give it that ability to do that. So you might think of things like institutional organization, leadership, planning, anything that sort of, excuse me, makes that group cohesive and helps to sort of sustain it through these different types of events. Excuse me. So capacity building is putting that social, cultural, and institutional infrastructure in place to create the capacity and resilience that ultimately we want for these groups as well as for our overall systems. So this includes lots of things, training, people, the mission statement, resources, technology, you name it, right? Like, again, these groups are so diverse that could mean lots of different things. So we're really just focusing on sort of a slice of this today. Okay, so I'm going to sort of jump right into the research before I really talk about the methods here in a second. And that's because I kind of want to highlight this what I think is a pretty critical point of something that we learned from doing this research. So one of the first questions that we would ask people as we were doing interviews, people who we were interviewing that were affiliated with watershed groups, was like, what were their goals? And, right out the gate, you would get these high order goals. And this makes a lot of sense. We want to improve water quality. We want to improve our community. We want to clean up this waterway, right? That makes sense to me. And they want to do that all built on the knowledge that these groups have of those waterways, of their conditions, of the management strategies, right? Now, if we took that goal, right, and thought of that as like what's going to actually support that goal, this is where I think the nuance of doing the type of research that we did was very valuable because it actually rested more on this idea of expertise and legitimacy. So while groups are establishing these higher order goals, right, what they're really talking about is the importance of being perceived as experts and thus being legitimate, right? And or being perceived as a legitimate partner. And as a result of that, they get a place at the table. So groups themselves want to achieve these water quality goals, right? But they can't achieve them if they're not sitting at the table with the other groups, the municipalities, the private sector groups who are all sort of working together on different projects or different issues. And the only way that they're going to get a seat at that table is if that external perception of those groups is that they have the appropriate expertise and they are sort of organizationally legitimate, right? So if you talk to people who collaborate with these groups, right, the perception of groups that function well, right, is not just that they have expertise, but that they're goal oriented, they have good relationships, they retain knowledge over time. And as a result of all of this, right, they're often invited to help sort of solve problems or work on specific projects. So that expertise and legitimacy is really important, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in later on. But I just, like I said, want to frame it. The sort of flip side of this is that um, groups that are perceived to not function well often don't have well-developed capacity. And again, we'll sort of dive into that here in a minute. So just sort of keep that in the top of your mind. Okay, so let's talk about the project. So I can remember Emily and I sitting down and talking about this, several years ago, maybe more than I should admit. We had kind of inherited this project from a grant that actually our old executive director, Maureen, gave to us. And so Emily, who is also a social scientist herself, among many hats that she wears, we sat down and we thought about, all right, how can we sort of think about the mission of the Watershed Alliance and then sort of leverage the resources we have to do this project to kind of help meet this mission. So one of the big drivers for this project was we wanted to have some deliverables that could help support watershed groups. The second driver of this, and this, perhaps came from my end, is I started looking around at capacity building research in the academic literature and really saw that it was pretty limited. There's a gap there, and that you might find a few case studies or examples. Here's something that didn't work, or here's something that did work. There was really no sort of like collective view of like how do we sort of understand capacity building and start sort of taking steps to build it within these communities. So we have these two drivers here, and we developed a research project around the question, what does a group need to be successful, right? In other words, what does a group need to establish and achieve their goals? And I want to note, and many of you may agree or disagree with this, but we were skeptical that money was the best answer here, despite it being almost, and I say this maybe more anecdotally, but almost the most common answer that we would get, right? You know, if you're just talking to people about this, oh, money is the answer. They need more money. They need more resources. So we wanted to think, is there something more here? Okay. So the project itself, as I said, we developed a social science needs assessment approach, which meant that we used interviews and focus groups really to look for that qualitative nuance, right? So if you think of something like a survey, right, you know, that gives you, it can give you a lot of data, but it's very sort of surface level, right? You don't get the nuance. When you start doing interviews, you get more detail, more fine tuning of the information that you're getting. So that was really why we wanted to do interviews. The interviews themselves were with watershed group participants, anybody who was sort of a member of a watershed group. And the focus groups was kind of a mixed bag. We had like academics, people from municipalities, just any community partners. And we kind of sorted them. We had four focus groups, so we sorted them in sort of three like categories and then one mixed category. But the point of the focus groups is those were people who work with watershed groups, right? So we're getting this internal view from the interviews, right? And kind of this external views from the focus groups. We ask questions about strengths, needs, challenges, and opportunities. So almost like a SWOT assessment. And what we know about using a needs assessment approach, a needs assessment research methodology, is that what that does, it really orients the research towards application, right? So what we learn, we can also then take and apply to um, some sort of outcome. I'm feeling like I probably don't really need to spend a lot of time talking about the Hudson River, but I think the most important thing to identify here, hopefully that we would all agree on, is that it's very big, politically fractured, and diverse, right? And that makes it a really good place to think about this. So we have these different sort of orders of watershed that we could think about. And we even have like kind of interesting models like the New York City water supply system that we can sort of compare it to. So there's a lot going on here. It's very complex. It's very challenging. And of course, we've got a lot of good relationships in here. So that made this a great case for working through this project. Okay, so after we conducted those interviews, that took us a couple years. We actually ran into COVID during this project, so we had to kind of do a little mid-course correction, but then we did an analysis. Emily did a lot of work on this. It's worthy of pointing out. And so let's talk a little bit about what we learned. So as I said before, one of the most important things I think that we kind of got out of this was this expertise and legitimacy idea, right? That watershed group, the ability of a watershed group to achieve their goals has a lot to do with the community's perception of them, who they are, and their expertise, and what would ultimately result in being invited to the table to solve problems, right? So this is what I said before. Now, a little bit of nuance here. When we think about this idea of expertise, you know, it's kind of like the content area expertise, but then also the perception of being an expert, right? In the content area expertise, a lot of participants were pretty ambivalent about that. We've got that expertise, or we've got partners with that expertise. We know how to get that information if we need it. It was much more about Do our potential partners or collaborators know us and think about us as experts, right? And so that gets us more into this legitimacy idea. So, again, thinking about this expertise and legitimacy idea, using that as a way to sort of see groups who may be perceived as experts or not, or illegitimate or not, right? What we started to see the relationship between was those groups who had it or didn't, and those groups who seem to have well-developed capacity. Okay, so here's the meat, right? So what does then that capacity look like, right? Again, just emphasizing that capacity here means groups will have a higher likelihood of meeting their goals, and that's ultimately what we want. So through our content analysis, we really saw like four major themes emerge. There was a bunch of other ones, and again, you can go to the needs assessment on the website if you wanted to kind of get into that detail a little bit more. But I want to talk about these top four here today because I think they really resonate, particularly for groups in the Hudson Valley. And again, I just want to say that, this may be slightly different for different groups. This is not a one size fits all sort of silver bullet, but I do think the four that we're identifying here are pretty crucial for any successful group. So that's leadership, identity, structure and planning, and succession planning. And so I'll quickly sort of talk about what each of these mean, give you a little quote to sort of amplify it a little bit, and then we'll get to some of these final thoughts. So the first one is leadership. We probably all know how important leadership is in your own institutions, in the world. Leadership to me, and I think how we identified it in the paper, is the ability to organize people towards a common goal. What's important and very notable about leadership is that it is a skill like anything else, right? It deserves training and ongoing development. I used to think, and I'm sure others did as well, that there were like natural born leaders. And of course, there are some characteristics that are probably very helpful there. But the bottom line is people need training and ongoing development to continue to be good and effective leaders. And watershed groups need good leadership and good leadership training. So, how did people talk about this? Leadership is hard. I guess I'm not very experienced with things like this. Rules are a little clearer in a business setting. You can't fire someone in a watershed group. And I have to say that last line sends me every time I think about it, because I could just totally relate to what this person is saying. Another person. I really think we need some resources that taught people how to marshal their energy towards their mission. Leadership is a skill like anything else. Working in community groups is a skill. People don't just show up and know how to do it. So to teach people how to work as a team, to communicate effectively, and to have good leadership. So again, what we're seeing is those groups that were effective, right, have good leadership. And those that were not, were sort of struggling with leadership. The next theme is identity. And so in this context, identity is about establishing who a group is and what it does. And when I think about this, and hopefully you do too, this is both the external perception of who a group is, what they're working on, what value they might bring to a particular conversation, but it is also internal, right? So that the different group members, right, are not looking at each other, trying to figure out what we're doing or going off on their own or starting to argue. Um, I often tell my team I kind of use two phrases and the importance of doing things like establishing mission statements, goals, and tasks, right? One is what if I got hit by a bus tomorrow? Would this project that we're working on be able to be sustained? And would we meet the goals that we're supposed to be meeting? Right? So we need to have the mission statement, goals, and tasks in place, right? That make it clear so that if I disappear tomorrow, we can still get this done. And then the other thing I tell my team is what if you and I get in a big fight, right? we still have to get a job done, right? So if we're even if we're mad at each other, we still have to be able to figure out how to get these deliverables in place. It is having clear-cut expectations that helps us make sure that we sustain the project that we're working on. So it's really about sort of creating the rules for the institution, not the rules for the people. So mission statements, goals, and tasks, this is what often informs an identity. And groups need help developing missions, goals, and tasks. I think understanding our role has been a tricky process. There's a lot of different, I'd say, like organizational mandates and expectations from each of the different people involved. So understanding what, as a watershed group, we're aiming to do is a pretty tricky thing. So you're hearing that frustration. I think that has a lot to do with not having spent the front end work of developing that mission statement, goals, and tasks, and then things became dispersed over a period of time as different interests started, I guess, competing for what the group would do. Relatedly, we're talking about structure and planning. So that's not just your mission statement, right? But you also need the things like the establishment of bylaws, tasks, goals, responsibilities, accountability, right? Like who's doing what, who makes sure things get done, who's taking the notes at the meeting, right? These things are obviously probably under the mission, goals, and tasks, but still very important. And watershed groups need help developing structure and planning. I was just thinking if there's some way to provide organizational structure, and I have no idea how, but an organizational audit or help with setting up a new, because a lot of these groups already exist, but maybe are, not doing so well right now, or really doing well, but could take a little bit of a push to be even better. So some sort of way to help those groups kind of self-assess or bring somebody else in. Just do a quick, here are the things that your group is doing well and might need. So again, just seeing the sort of basics of structure and planning being in place can really help groups, even groups that are already well established, right? It's good to sort of revisit that. And I'm going to talk about an example of that in a minute as well. Okay, so the fourth theme here is succession planning. And obviously this ties to leadership, but really it ties to a bunch of different roles that watershed groups have, right? And that's anticipating and planning for personnel change. I know that you can probably think about leaders that you wonder if they are gone, what would happen to the project we're working on? What would we do, right? Planning for success, planning for change is hard, particularly at the leadership level, but it must happen, right? We have to be thinking about how these roles will be filled when somebody potentially gets hit by a bus or somebody just decides to retire and move to North Carolina, like one of our Wavemaker awardees did. Groups, like all the other themes that we've identified today, have talked about needing help with succession planning. It worries me if I were to step down right now that I don't know how the position would be filled. How does it maintain, sustain itself, and go from year to year? For how long will it be around? I have no clue. If the current leader drops out somehow, will it be able to carry on? I'm not sure. I'm not sure of that. And again, what I would do is just say tap into your own experiences and think about how you have either been a leader or been in groups with leaders like that and wondered that exact same thing. There is a process for solving that, and that is succession planning. Okay, so I'll tie up the research here, and then I want to talk a little bit about what then the Watershed Alliance sort of did with some of this work and what I see as kind of some things to consider and next steps. So our kind of top line here, summary of this project is effective groups are likely to have solid structure, clear goals, and the capacity to maintain their own continuation. Effective groups have put the time and effort into capacity building, right? And that has then ensured their sustainability and their ability to achieve goals. And And again, that's what we want. We want these groups to be effective and fill those roles. So we see the groups that are doing this effectively, and we see the groups that are weak in that respect. And those groups often don't have good capacity. So what does that tell us, right? Those of us who work with these groups. If we want to support watershed groups, particularly with limited resources, then that's where we need to be putting those resources, right? Not necessarily in the next big project, some implementation, um, some grant to build a green infrastructure facility over here, right? Now, I'm not saying those things aren't important, but really what we want to do is, I think, take those limited resources and instead put them in ways to help these groups figure out who they are, how they can meet their goals, right? And then when they go out and start soliciting those grants and funding, they can actually successfully implement those projects, right? They can be good partners at the table. Now, again, I'm going to remind you that if you want access to this paper, you can email me or it's on the website. Again, I think Jen's going to put it in the chat, and you can get the full needs assessment report on the Watershed Alliance website as well. Okay, I've got a couple more things I want to say, and then we'll have some time for questions. So as an outcome of this, I guess I want to say, we've really been trying to put our money where our mouth is. We then took what we learned from the needs assessment, and we have thought a lot about our mission and how we can really support capacity building for community groups. So this year, we have a program for capacity building technical assistance. It was a grant program. This is the one that Emily mentioned at the beginning of the talk, where we funded 4 groups to really sort of think about and build their internal capacity. What was exciting about that was, even though we could only support 4 of those applications, the remaining, I think Emily said 12, I think that's right. The remaining 12, which were all pretty good applications, we were then able to build a relationship, rely on a relationship with River Network to have some smaller capacity building workshops that almost all of those groups then are now participating in. So we're kind of seeing like 2 different levels of providing this capacity building research. And again, it's worth emphasizing that it would not be without our partners, the estuary program with NUIPIC, funding from places like the flood. I'm sorry, Emily is probably better at talking about where the funding is going. So I'm just going to continue to say support, but support from partners like the Flood Resilience Network, River Network, Sea Grant, and others, right? Where we're working with them specifically and trying to drive this question around capacity building. We've also put a ton of resources on our website. You should go check them out. Things that can help you work on your own capacity as a group, to help develop collaborative opportunities. And even we've got this organizational development checklist. So I really want to encourage you to start there, to go check things out. But then please reach out to us, because we are constantly thinking about how we can continue to learn about and develop what we got from this needs assessment. So I want to give you a kind of a little case study. I've been as a sort of member or on the leadership team of the Pocantico River Watershed Alliance for, again, it's almost embarrassing to try to remember how long. And I've been doing that with Mike Rubo, who I just want to note, between the two of us, maybe have 30 years of experience in working like with watershed groups or nonprofits. And our group has really struggled over the years. It particularly took a hit during COVID, and it's just been hard to sort of reinvigorate the leadership team and figure out a real purpose. And that was despite having spent a lot of time working on things like a mission statement and really sort of creating an identity for this group. What I think is important here, right, is Mike and I, we applied for the technical assistance grant. We didn't get it, but then we were invited to participate in the workshops, and we kind of begrudgingly said, all right, well, we'll do it, but, are we really going to learn anything? Well, it turns out we did learn some stuff, and most of what we learned had a lot to do with just reinvesting ourselves in this process that I'm talking about with you here today, right? So these kind of like old curmudgeons who, are pretty resistant to doing new stuff started to really rethink what we wanted to do with the Watershed Alliance, the Pocantico River Watershed Alliance. And through that, we've actually kind of reoriented what we're thinking about reorienting the group around sort of service to the community and application through the resources of PACE. So again, looking at models like you see at places like Bard and Vassar, things like that. Participating in the workshop helped generate those ideas, help us think of some people to connect with. So what I want to encourage you to think about here is that even if you're in a group that feels very strong, or you're a person like me who's kind of an old curmudgeon, it is worthwhile reinvesting yourself in this process. Okay, so this will be my last slide before questions, but I want to kind of give us some final thoughts, and I want to think a little bit about a next research project that perhaps some of you might be interested in. So as I said, strong groups have good capacity. That's kind of an underlying thing that we have learned here. Money is important, but capacity is arguably more important. So groups should focus on capacity first. And that is the lesson that I have tried to take from everything that we've learned over these past few years. As people who work with these groups, right, we have to reorient how we think about how we partner with these groups, right? We have to be putting resources into capacity building that support those groups, right, in sort of creating their identity, their leadership, and things like that. We have to think a lot about what we're asking of them and try to meet them where they are. If we're providing $5,000 grants to somebody, it should not have a 15-page grant application page, right? So we really need to be tailoring the resources that we have, which are very limited, to what the groups are and what the groups have the ability to do. So that means the work we need to do means it needs to be very local and context specific. And I don't think this is new to anybody here. We must continue to remove barriers to implementation. And I think this fits right in line with our diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations that we've been having over the past couple of years, which are being attacked currently right now. Despite what is happening within these conversations, it is still very important. There, communities of color, working class groups, disadvantaged groups, vulnerable groups continue to take the brunt of environmental conditions, and the changes that we want to make would benefit them the most, right? So we have to continue to think about how do we remove these barriers to participation and implementation. Okay, and then a final thought on research. So again, if you are a wonky, nerdy academic like me and this interests you, please reach out. I've been thinking a lot about what the next project would be. And building off of this, I've been thinking a lot about this concept of resilience. And as I articulated earlier, right, we talk about resilience as bouncing back to normal. But I think there's a really good question here, and not my original question, but do we want to bounce back to current conditions? Or do we want to take these events, these moments, as opportunities to bounce forward into something new? And could we take something like move this beyond just a case study, right? And really sort of look at strategies for bouncing forward after these types of events. So how would we kind of put a research project in together that would kind of ask that question? So again, that interests me. I have probably 50 other interests that if you ever wanted to talk about, please reach out to me or reach out to somebody from the Watershed Alliance, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So with that, I'll end. Again, I just want to say if you have any, if you want to reach out to me, please do. If you want the paper, you can email me. I'm going to stop share and then hand it over to Emily.
Great. Michael, thank you so much for your presentation, and so appreciate all of the different hats you wear and how you wore each of those hats in the context of this presentation as a researcher and professor at Pace University, as a longtime Hudson River Watershed Alliance board member, and as a watershed group member leader yourself. I think, empathy you have for all of these different roles and contexts and
For real.
situations. Um, We invite you to open up the Q&A box and type any questions that you might have into the chat. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, I'll just reflect on when we started this needs assessment process, we sort of expected to hear certain things from watershed groups. We thought that we would hear that they really needed science, they needed
Hmm.
data for decision making. We thought we were going to hear that they needed money. And those were not the things that we heard back from the watershed groups. We heard we have all the science we need, but we need all of these other elements of the capacity building that Michael discussed, the leadership, the organizational development tools to really put that information into practice. And we need all of these other pieces in order to even get the funding that then made, we could really leverage to take some of those next steps. So just really, this is why we do this kind of thing, because we might come in with our own assumptions, and by
Mm.
having these conversations we can really challenge those and learn what will be most effective.
Yeah, I gotta agree with you, Emily. I found that I can remember us having those conversations, like just with all our skepticism, but really no evidence to show, you know, that we were right. I mean, and I mean, that's probably a pretty bold way to put it, but I think it was very gratifying to see, as we were doing the interviews and we're like, okay, we're really seeing that there's something more here. No, so anyway, I'm just agreeing with you and enjoying reflecting on it.
So we're sure you have questions, so please don't hesitate to open up that Q&A box and write your questions in. Take advantage of some of this time and Michael's academic expertise as well. I'll also mention that in the program of the cohort model, River Network has developed a series of self-guided resources and videos, on-demand videos. And right now, the watershed groups participating in this cohort have first access to this. All of these materials will be on our website by the end of the summer, so that other groups can take those and, again, look at where you might need some support, do some of that self-guided work, get access to information in the videos to really help move it forward. So we're really trying to create these tools at different scales for groups to use wherever you're at, whatever your current place is, to help you get to the next level.
I see a couple questions here. You want me to try to tackle them?
Yep, I'll read them out loud,
Okay.
so we have it for the recording.
Yeah.
So, first question is this being recorded and shared? Yes, we're recording this and we'll be posting it on the Hudson River Watershed Alliance's YouTube channel. Okay, would you say that these same needs are applicable across other types of groups? Where else could you see the use for capacity to advance important environmental work?
Yeah. And I'm seeing about 4 questions here, so I'm going to try to go through these quick, but definitely if whoever that is wants to reach out to me, I'm happy to talk more. So I would almost universally say yes. And I'll give you 2 examples that very quickly that I think to me just resonate with this answer. And it's not always in the environmental world. So one is I was talking in this capacity work to with some people from the Urban Field Station, Lindsay and Heather and a few other people or excuse me, Michelle, who work over there, and they were like, "Oh, we're thinking about this exact same thing, right? How do we sort of support what they are often called stewards or community groups?" Right. And the major issue that they're dealing with is the capacity of these groups, right? So they are doing environmental work, but probably with more emphasis on the community side. And one thing that she had talked about was how talking about capacity actually brought together these groups that had different missions. And that was pretty cool. And I will say at my own institution at Pace, we have been trying to manage up a lot and talk about the importance of establishing goals to sort of help us as a unit, right? Like all the different faculty and staff work together to make sure that we're doing things that the administration wants. That's not a sideways critique of where I work because we're a big bureaucratic institution, but it really just shows you how those same capacity building tasks, I think, are being asked for at multiple scales and across lots of different groups. So again, the answer here is yes, and I think it's almost universally applicable. All right, Emily, next.
Yeah, and I'll just add that there's a lot of resources out there for capacity building of nonprofits, like the Land Trust Alliance provides specific tools for land trusts. the New York Council of Nonprofits provides lots of resources for nonprofits, and watershed groups exist in a sort of a separate sector because not all of them are nonprofits, not all of them want to be nonprofits. We've got intermunicipal councils, and so there's this niche for this kind of work for the Alliance to support that doesn't exist in other places. Okay, next question.
Mm,
And I'm going to take this one, if that's okay, Michael. So
yeah.
through this research and the Alliance's current grants, what have you learned about examples from other states and regions about models for assisting watershed groups to raise capacity? Are there other places we can look to as models? Thank you for this question. We actually worked this semester with a class of Bard College graduate students in the Center for Environmental Policy, and our breakfast webinar last month was them presenting their research. They did interviews of watershed planning and management experts from all across the country, focused on regions that have similar weather patterns to New York State, but also have all different kinds of governance structures. So we learned a ton. They actually, in addition to the webinar, wrote up a report that we'll be including in a soon to be published report publication that the Alliance will be putting out. And so, yes, there's places that we can look to for models. They had a ton of great examples of those. And I'll also mention that I'm in touch with colleagues in similar positions across the country, notably the Pennsylvania Organization for Watersheds and Rivers Power is doing an almost parallel capacity building technical assistance program that we are. And they were able to show to their funders that if the watershed groups can build capacity, better on the ground projects will be implemented, that there's this real direct correlation. And so we're going to be comparing notes with them and understanding some of their tools, best practices as we, collaborate with our colleagues around the country to move this work forward. Anything you want to add, Michael?
No, but I do have another really cool example of Portland, Oregon. So if anybody ever wants that, you could just reach out to me. But it was really like, I think basically the moral of the story was like the Portland DEP had a grant, nobody was applying to it, or the people they thought were going to apply to it didn't apply to it. So they did like a lot of internal reflection, which had a lot to do with like revisiting their goals and how the proposal matched up, and then they retailored the proposal, and then it ended up getting a lot of the applicants that they wanted. So again, it's just to emphasize that this isn't just for you looking at other groups, it's often for you to look at yourself as well. All right, that's all I'll say.
Great, thank you. We have a question about legitimacy, right? So how can a watershed group member who feels like they lack the perception of expertise work to advance the capacity of their group?
Oh, I mean, I don't I get the resources that are on the Watershed Alliance page. I mean, I just, like I said, if you go back to the Pocantico River one, and I mean, I'm not kidding when I call myself an old curmudgeon. You know what I mean? I'm like, I don't want to go to this workshop. I've seen this stuff before, but we did it. And I really, it was like Mike and I were just talking the other day, and we were both like, you know, I'm almost embarrassed that like I tell people to do this stuff, but I was almost refusing to do it myself. And then I did it, and I'm like, okay, it was worth it. So go get those resources and just start from number one. You know what I mean? You'll move through stuff. You'll see yourself getting smarter. You'll see yourself grow. But capacity building is not a one-off thing, right? It's something that you're constantly doing. So at the Watershed Alliance, we are constantly reevaluating the things that we do, right? To make sure they're meeting our mission and to make sure we're meeting the needs of the community. So that would be my starting point. And then once you get some finer detail, we really need this. That's where you can start going to specific people to ask for specific resources.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to jump into because I see in the chat there's some comments about
Hmm.
we go to local officials and it's really challenging to get that seat at the table. And so
Hmm.
I want to acknowledge that with this question, there might be a challenge within your group setting that you as an individual may be perceived as not having expertise. And there might be some group dynamic challenges that could be. And then looking outside the group, there might be all the other stakeholder challenges. And so just to reinforce, come talk with us. We have seen in terms of that external piece that the science can really legitimize, that partnerships can really legitimize, that if you
Hmm.
show the collaborations with all of your partners, if you bring in some of the science-based information, that can really help and the value of good relationship building and really understanding, listening to other people, understanding where they're coming from, what their interests are, and then working to collaborate from there. And again, for the internal group dynamic, want to acknowledge that this can be a real challenge when the
Hmm.
group doesn't have internal structure, decision making, frameworks for participation and contribution, and that power dynamics really exist, and it can be really challenging if your expertise or experience is not valued in your group to make some of that headway. So we just want to acknowledge that that's really challenging, and I think that the investment in some of these structures, bringing in a third party facilitator, can be really valuable to help mediate some of these conversations and create some of those structures for better participation. So it's a little bit iterative, but I think that there are tools to use to help with those types of challenges.
And Lori, I mean, since I kind of know, I know where you're coming from, so I want to sort of speak to this a little bit more broadly. So I'm going to say some things that you probably know, but in asking this question, I think it's in just in science communication in general, right? I mean, this is getting back to what I was talking about, and this actually goes to the next question, which I'll elaborate on a little bit more. But a group can be very focused on a single issue, right? And that's all their energy is going into that issue. But if you go talk to somebody in a municipality, that's just one of 100 things that they're working on, right? So to me, the best way to sort of get that seat at the table, in addition to what Emily just said, right, is to really think about building relationships and common goals, right? And so like in the climate communication field, right? People say, just introducing facts is not the answer, right? Because people don't respond positively to that. The best way to sort of build relationships with somebody to talk about something like climate change is to find shared goals, right? So to me, I often go to municipalities and be like, well, I see that you have to do this, but there's a challenge here, right? And we can actually fill that challenge, right? We can do a little research for you. We can rally some constituents to come to the table to help you. You know what I mean? And that takes time, which is frustrating. But to me, the approach is always like not coming with my issue first, but coming to look for some common ground first. And then once you build that relationship, then you're just kind of like, well, let's work on this, right? Um, you want me to tackle this next one, Emily?
Yeah, just to acknowledge we're a little over time, so we're gonna just take this last question and then close out. So
I'll do it quick.
the question is, what are some of the governance gaps that you see watershed groups filling?
And okay, so this is exactly what I was saying before. When municipalities, they have responsibilities and they also have limitations in things they can say and things that they could do. Private sector, same thing, right? A municipality can't be out there being, talking about the president, right? They really have to be sort of apolitical or politically neutral, whereas watershed groups don't necessarily have to be. Now, I'm not saying that's your first approach, but sometimes that's valuable to municipalities, right? They want to get something done, but they got to build political will for it. They can't actually do the work of building the political will, but the watershed group can. That's a case, right? And that's not every group. So the point that I'm making here in terms of filling gaps, right? In terms of advocacy, in terms of looking at single issues, in terms of rallying our community together, in terms of doing specific types of research, it's all about kind of going back to this question where I was responding to Lori, where I'm saying, this is about figuring out your mission, right? What you want to emphasize, and then figuring out how to build partnerships to help you achieve your goals, right? So doing those things first, it just changes how people see you, right? So I'll just end there, and again, happy to respond to other questions at another time.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael, again for presenting this morning. Thanks to everyone for joining us and your great questions and discussion and comments in the chat. We will be sending out the recording to everyone along with some of those links to the paper and the needs assessment project, along with that organizational development checklist. And later on this summer, we'll have a ton more resources for watershed groups and other entities alike. So I see some comments in the chat. Municipalities have limited capacity, small organizations have limited capacity. You probably are feeling the crunch of limited capacity in your work and life. And so these are really tools that, while targeted to watershed groups, I think are really broadly applicable. So thank you so much for joining us this morning, and we'll see you next month. Thanks so much, everyone.